Okay, so good evening and welcome to Royal Holloway, University of London. My name is Shobana Dissanayake and I'm a lecturer here in the Department of Biological Sciences. And of course, we would have loved to have our very beautiful campus, but unfortunately, the current situation has meant that this lecture has had to go online. Nonetheless, this has meant that we can welcome several of you from all over the world, and we give you a very, very warm welcome. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the Department of Biological Sciences Jack Pridham Annual Lecture. Professor Jack Pridham was a renowned plant biochemist and the founder of the Department of Biochemistry here at Royal Holloway. This was later to become the Department of Biological Sciences as it remains today. Professor Pridham was passionate about science outreach and loved to debate the hot topics of the day, such as genetic modification, cot deaths, and mobile phone masts. So it is in keeping with his legacy that I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Liz Whittaker to speak on the current hot topic of the day, COVID-19 and its impact on child health. Dr. Liz Whittaker is a clinical lecturer in paediatric infectious diseases and immunology at Imperial College London and is a clinician at the Department of Paediatric Infectious Diseases and Immunology at St Mary's Hospital. Sorry, please, could I ask everybody to mute, please? Thank you. Dr. Whittaker's main research interests are the ontogeny of infant immune responses to a variety of pathogens. As the co-lead for the High Consequence Infectious Diseases Unit for Children at St Mary's, she was involved in the COVID pandemic from early January and is on the Royal College Paediatrics and Child Health COVID Advisory Committee. So I'm going to have to ask that everybody mute themselves, otherwise you interfere with the lecture recording. With colleagues from across London, she identified and defined the emerging inflammatory condition in children with COVID, PIMS or MISC, and is involved in the variety of studies exploring the epidemiology, pathogenesis, management, and long-term outcomes. Dr. Whittaker has a strong interest in teaching and training and is currently the quality advisor to the Paediatric Allergy, Immunology and Infectious Diseases Committee at the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Dr. Whittaker completed her undergraduate training in medicine at Trinity College Dublin, Ireland, including a Health Research Board funded MSc in biochemistry. This included a basic research project in the role of NF-kappa B in 5-lipoxygenase activation with Professor Luke O'Neill, for which she won the Bruno Orsi Medal for Best Research Project. Following this, she trained as a paediatrician in London and was successfully awarded the Academic Clinical Fellowship in Paediatric Infectious Diseases in 2006. The 9-month research period associated with this fellowship allowed her to develop her interests in paediatric infectious diseases and involved 2 research projects on TB biomarkers and interferon gamma release assays, which resulted in a number of presentations and publications. During this time, she was involved in the setting up of the Paediatric TB Europe network to facilitate collaboration between paediatricians caring for children with TB and improved care for children with TB in Europe. She completed the Gorgas Diploma course in Clinical Tropical Medicine in Peru and was awarded a DTMNH in 2009. Dr. Whittaker is a member of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, Academic Paediatrics Association, British Paediatric Allergy, Infection and Immunity Group, Children's HIV Association, International Child Health Group and the Paediatric TB Europe Network, and is a steering committee member of the British Association of Paediatric TB. She plays an active role in the Centre for International Child Health at Imperial College London. Before I welcome Dr. Whittaker to take over the presentation, could I please ask that you all ensure that your mics are switched off throughout the lecture? If you have any questions as we go through, please type these questions into the chat, and at the end of the talk, I will ask as many of these to Dr. Whittaker. If we have time, we can open the mic for further questions. I should also let you know now that this lecture is being recorded. So without further ado, please may I welcome Dr. Whittaker and pass on the presentation to her.
Oh, wow. Thanks, Shobana. That was, I feel really, yes, all these accolades. I feel like, how have I ever kept up with my box TV set watching habit? But thank you very much. So Shobana and I met when I did my ACF here at Imperial back in 2006, where we shared an office. And so it was really lovely to get in touch and talk about doing the lecture today. Hopefully you can see my slides. And I'm going to keep going. So I just wanted to say, I also have a personal link to Royal Holloway College because my mum, who is in a number of these pictures, went to university at Royal Holloway. She was a botanist, and she did her undergraduate degree from 1958 to 1961, had an active role in the lacrosse team. She's here on the bottom left of this picture here, and here in some very jolly summer party here. And this is her graduation picture here. And then she went on and did some postdoctoral research as well, looking at genetic modification and botany in Royal Holloway before moving to Hull in 1965, where she met my dad. And then they subsequently moved to Ireland, where she was a lecturer in the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. And the one sunny day of the year, they took the photo. And she worked there from 1978 to 2001. And as you can see by the thick woolly jumpers and the raincoats, Ireland has got a delightful climate. So I was brought up in Ireland. I went to Trinity College in Dublin, where I managed to find a few more sunny days to take some representative photographs, and graduated in biochemistry and medicine from Trinity before coming over to London to seek my career, where I basically landed on my feet by joining the team, including Shobana at Imperial College London at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington, as she said. And then I basically a bit of a globetrotter, itchy feet, and I would encourage anybody thinking about it to consider studying global health, because you have great opportunities to travel and see interesting places. So I spent time working in Peru and East Africa, and then did my PhD in Cape Town, looking at mycobacterial immune responses in children before training in London, in Great Ormond Street and Imperial College, amongst other settings. And that's where I ended up working as a consultant, and I've been here now for nearly 5 years. And so it's a real thrill for me, and I know my mum would be really proud that I'm giving this lecture this year, where she went to university. Unfortunately, she died in 2008, but I suspect she's watching from somewhere. So what I'm going to do today is give a little bit of an overview of COVID-19 from a paediatric perspective. So children have had a very different experience to adults in terms of this virus. It has minimally affected them from a disease perspective, but maximally affected them from every other part of their life. And I'm just going to start with a reminder of what all the words mean, because I think they get bandied about quite a lot. And since I'm going to be using them, it's always good to start with an explanation. So SARS-CoV-2, or Serious Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, is the virus that started this whole thing off. And the disease that it caused is called COVID-19, and this was named by the WHO in February, is an abbreviation of Coronavirus Disease 2019. And it's so confusing because this all happened in 2020, but the first case was actually just on the new year in December 31st in 2019. So it's that very confusing thing where we've named it after last year. And I think most of us kind of hope we could restart 2020 again in January. Coronaviruses, and there are lots of them, and these alpha and beta coronaviruses in particular, cause the common cold. So most of us will have had mild infections with them. And then these other coronaviruses, the respiratory syndrome coronaviruses, cause much more significant disease. And so just a bit about those. So in 2003, the first outbreak with SARS-CoV-1, as it's now known, or just SARS-CoV as we used to affectionately call it, was discovered in China. It spread across East Asia and then across to Toronto predominantly, and 774 people were known to have died from that. And I think that you can look at the outcome of the pandemic in countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and China. And they have a much better outcome in terms of how they've managed the pandemic, because they had such an awful time with this virus back in 2003 and 2004. And so they had different policies in terms of testing, tracking, tracing, and shutting things down because they didn't want a repeat of what happened at that time. And unfortunately, we didn't learn that lesson quite so well. In 2012, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome coronavirus was discovered in Saudi and killed even more people, 862. And mostly we think that was transmitted to humans from bats and camels. And so as an infectious diseases consultant in London, if we had families who came over from the Middle East and had respiratory illnesses, we'd always ask if they'd been camel back racing. And to be honest, we haven't seen a case of MERS, and they never said yes. But there you go. So this is a pangolin, a really beautiful animal, and it, amongst other animals, including bats and snakes, have been implicated in the leap from animals to humans of SARS-CoV-2. It's very unlikely it was released from a laboratory, and there have been so many urban myths and legends about this virus that it's really important that we debunk some of them. Okay, so what do we know about the coronaviruses and children before? So I mentioned the SARS-CoV-1 outbreak in 2003, and this, just like COVID-2, disproportionately affected adults. So out of a total 8,000 plus cases, only 100 were in children, and in children, particularly those under 12, they had a very mild course of the disease, and there were no deaths. Teenagers have more severe disease, a bit more like adults. And this was seen similarly with the MERS-CoV pandemic later on in that decade. Again, severe disease disproportionately in adults. This has a higher death rate compared to the number of cases, and there were fewer paediatric cases, the majority of which were asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. And there were 2 deaths in infants in this cohort. But we've always understood that we are unlikely to see children being severely unwell with either SARS-CoV-1 or MERS-CoV-2, MERS-CoV. And I guess it's really important to think about why that is. And initially, in March and April, when we were, setting up our plans and how we were going to try and manage this pandemic, we were certainly thinking about understanding why children were minimally affected. And to know that, we first need to think about how does SARS-CoV-2 cause infection. So you'll have heard about the angiotensin converting enzyme 2, or ACE2, and this is expressed in cells throughout the body. So the eyes, the brain, the airway, the heart, the kidneys, pretty much you name it, it's expressed in those cells. And this enzyme is normally involved in blood pressure. So we use ACE inhibitors, which prevent this enzyme from working to treat high blood pressure in adults and children. But SARS-CoV-2 binds to the ACE2 receptor. So this is the virus binding to a receptor on the surface of the cell, and then the virus is able to enter the cell and replicate and produce lots of copies before being released to infect other cells. So that's the way of entry into the cell. We know that, I've just told you that this receptor is on all the body. And so although we predominantly think of this as being a respiratory illness, actually we now know, looking back, and there have been publications, and there's a tsunami of publications on COVID-19, that it has affected pretty much every part of the body, but predominantly the lungs, but smell and taste, as we know, anosmia has now become one of the symptoms that suggests you should go and have a test. But also conjunctivitis, things that we worry about. It causes acute cardiac injury, and we've seen that certainly in children, and also gastrointestinal effects and diarrhea. So it's very happy to make anybody unwell in any place. And this is just a little picture showing you how the virus affects people. And one of the reasons why it's so successful is that the most amount of virus is replicating at the very beginning, often even before people have symptoms, so when they're pre-symptomatic. And that's one of the reasons why it's transmitted, is because by the time people start to develop flu-like illness around about here, they've already been potentially transmitting it for 24 hours or 48 hours beforehand. We don't know that most people clear it at this stage and remain well with just very mild symptoms. A small proportion of people go on to get severe lung disease with difficulty breathing and needing oxygen, and with imaging, so it's about 14% of people, imaging that looks really nasty. If you're used to looking at chest x-rays and CTs, you can see that there's lots of disease through these lungs. And then when you look at this very unfortunate percentage, all of this white that you can see, both this is a chest x-ray and this is a CT, shouldn't be there. So this is the group of patients who get critical disease. And this is quite far down the line from infection. So people get admitted at this point, which is normally 7 to 10 days into infection. And then they tend to deteriorate about a week after that, so about 2.5 weeks into infection. And that's the very small group of people who get this cytokine storm where their inflammatory process gets really over the top. And so this is very much in adults. In children, we really only see this end of the spectrum, which we're very reassured by. Okay, and that became apparent very early on. So this was the first publication in February that came out of Wuhan in China, showing the age distribution of severe cases over here, but also just really reassuringly that children under 15 only accounted for 0.9% of all cases. 92% of them were non-severe, and there were no fatalities at all in that group of 1,000 children. And so as a mum and as a paediatrician, this was really lovely to hear, and we hoped that we would see the same thing if and when it ever came to us. I think at that point we're still feeling fairly optimistic about it not coming over to us. And this data is from the British Medical Journal. So this is a group, the ISARIC study you will have heard about in the media, is an observational study looking at respiratory illness that was actually set up not long after the swine flu pandemic, effectively because there was a recognition that when you have a big outbreak of illness, you need to have everything set up to rapidly gather data. So this was waiting. It was like a sleeping study that was woken up when we realized there was going to be a pandemic, and everybody was activated to start gathering data on people. And so they mostly have gathered adult data, but also pediatric data. And what you can see in this figure over here, in the top right-hand corner, is it shows who's been admitted, who's died, and who's been discharged. And this is by age. So right down the bottom where I've put the red box is young people under 19. And as you've heard in the media, by the time you're getting to over 75, you're much more likely to be admitted and become unwell. And unfortunately, that's where the greatest death rate is. But children are barely represented. They've got a tiny box on either side of this line showing how few of them are admitted. And of those who are admitted, the majority are discharged. So out of 138 hospitals across England and the UK, there were 651 children. And I can tell you that out of about 300,000 positive tests since March to at the end of August, there were only 9,000 positive tests in children. So a really tiny proportion, given that the UK population of children is about 16 million, it's really tiny numbers. So the majority, or a third of these patients, were under a year of age. And this is what we normally see in paediatrics. So this age group are the group who are most likely to become unwell and present to hospital with most infections. They're just a little bit more vulnerable. And that's the basis of my normal research in the pre-COVID time, wondering what it is that's different about their immune responses. At least 42% of these young people had one comorbidity. There were unfortunately 6 deaths in this cohort, and I think there have been about 16 deaths in total since February due to or attributed to COVID-19. All of these deaths in this study were in young people who had really significant underlying comorbidity, which is every death is a tragedy. But I think for these children in particular, any respiratory virus, whether that was flu or rhinovirus or enterovirus, might have resulted in a similar outcome. So we think that it was that COVID itself didn't have a particular reason for making these children unwell. 18% of them ended up in intensive care. And this is partly going to reflect the fact that when you get admitted to intensive care, you get tested. So there is always a bit of bias in who gets tested. And I can certainly think of a few children that we looked after who happened to be COVID positive, but were admitted for other reasons. So it's just always important to look at data critically. So risk factors are children under a month, adolescents, those of Black and ethnic minority, and then this group with PIMS that I'll talk about a little bit later. From the Black and ethnic minority perspective, we think it probably is more likely to reflect where the most transmission of the virus is happening, rather than there being an ethnic reason why they're more susceptible to becoming unwell. But it is something that we're studying through a variety of studies, including genomic, which is a national study looking at the genes in patients who have severe disease. So I just thought this is a diagram from a figure. There's a reference here at the bottom talking about why it is that children have a different phenotype of disease. I'm just running through them. So in your nose, it's layered with your nasal mucosa. And what we think is that children more frequently have common cold coronaviruses, those alpha and beta coronaviruses I talked about at the beginning. And when you've recently had one of those infections, your innate and your T-cell immunity in your nose is all ready to fight off the infection. So we think that children probably clear it when it gets into the nose straight away. Immune responses in children are also different, generally speaking. So they are better at clearing things. They have more Th2 as well as more Tregs. And they are more eosinophils, which is interesting because children often get more wheezy illness and allergy and asthma, and that may be related to differences in their immune responses. So there are pros and cons to everything that we have. Whereas in adults, they seem to be more likely to produce IL-6, and that seems to trigger the cytokine storm. And then the other final thing is that these 2 receptors, I mentioned ACE2 earlier, but this other really easily named TMPRSS2 receptor, which is how the virus enters the cells, are expressed less frequently in all of the tissues that children have. So they have fewer of the receptors to bring the cells in. In their mucosa, it's probably better at clearing it before it gets anywhere near the lung, and their immune responses are probably protected. Okay. The other thing that's probably really crucial, and this cartoon shows you a blood vessel in the child's lung on this side versus the blood vessel in an adult lung on this side. And what we know is that when you're young, your blood vessels are really healthy and in good condition. And whereas as you get older with time, and with obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, alcohol, all of these things have a negative impact on your blood vessels, and they get damaged. And when they're damaged, they start to become a little bit inflamed. So it's not uncommon for adults, and particularly older adults, to have a little bit of chronic inflammation in their blood vessels. So they're kind of predisposed. So when you have more of these receptors, the ACE2 and the TMPRSS2 receptors, more virus gets in, it triggers more of that IL-6 immune type that I was talking about, and then your blood vessels are already primed to become hyperinflammatory. So we know that this is probably why these risk factors are associated with risk disease in adults, and these risk factors don't exist in the blood vessels in the lungs of children. That's one of the reasons why they see less severe disease. And what we're more worried about in pediatrics and in the child health world is all the other things. So we're not so worried about COVID. I've shown you that we don't really see severe disease in children, but we're worried about all these things that are happening behind the scenes. So we know that there's been an increase in domestic violence and unemployment, poverty, child abuse. We know that closing schools is bad for you, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. And this is something we've been much more concerned about. So during the pandemic, a couple of things happened. We told everyone, we went into lockdown, and we, as a country and the government and all the people in charge, said, stay at home, protect the NHS, don't come to hospital. And this also happened in many of the settings. This is a paper from Italy showing that in 1 week in northern Italy, where they have the worst bit of the pandemic, they had 12 children who presented with delayed access because they were worried about going to hospital because they'd been told to stay at home, 6 of whom ended up in intensive care, and 4 of whom sadly died. And when we went and looked at this in a UK setting, this is a 2-week period in April, of 752 paediatricians, at least a third reported children with delayed presentation, and this is across all areas of the UK, with similar things to have been seen in Italy, like diabetes and sepsis and malignancy. And in that 2-week period, they identified 9 deaths that they think were directly related to people staying at home. And further, this is a paper from Great Ormond Street looking at abusive head trauma during the COVID-19 pandemic, showing that unfortunately in 2020, we've seen a much higher proportion of these cases, which is a real tragedy. And we know there are multiple factors that lead to this. So people lost their jobs and had no money, were at home spending more time together, they were extremely stressed and having a difficult time. And all of these factors predispose to non-accidental injury and safeguarding issues. Whenever there's stress in the home, these children are at the greatest risk. So very worrying data here. And I just wanted to talk about schools a little bit. COVID-19 has really increased the educational inequality. So we know that 188 countries internationally imposed countrywide school closures, which affected more than 1.5 billion children across the world. And we already knew before the pandemic that when you close down schools for 6 to 8 weeks in the summer, or longer if you're Irish, which we really liked, but maybe it wasn't great for us, that 25% of what you learned in the academic year is lost. And that's even with the kids getting, extracurricular things like popping to the museum, going to the library. These children, when they locked down the schools, were just staying at home with their parents, which for some people, particularly well-off families, was actually really good. They got more input. And we know that there's data showing that those families from higher socioeconomic groups spent 30% more time on home learning than those from poor families. This is partly because the parents would have been working from home, whereas in poorer families, they quite often were doing frontline work, cleaning, working in shops and working as cleaners and porters in hospitals and things like that. So I think that we know that these equalities are increasing. More than 2/3 of the countries internationally, this is UNICEF data, had introduced distance learning platforms, but this is much lower in low-income countries where people were already being digitally excluded. So what we're seeing is this widening of inequality, and these affected cohorts have an impact that lasts for the rest of their lives, because your exam results can dictate what happens next. It can dictate where you go to university, what kind of job you get, and there's some modelling data that shows about 15% of earnings can be lost by missing out on school. This paper looked at the outbreak, at the impact of the earthquake in Pakistan, in, I think, 2016 and showed that this had a big impact on school. And it's not just the time you miss, but also when you come back to school, the learning you're doing is spent catching up rather than covering new things. And this is just more UNICEF data showing the countries which have the lowest access to computers and laptops. So, for example, unsurprisingly, some of the poorest countries in the world, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, parts of Pakistan, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho, have less than 30% of the children have access to a digital device, whereas we're up here. So just thinking about the UK, it's about 9% of children in the UK don't have access to a laptop, desktop, or tablet at home. And these are used to access schoolwork, but also for other things that are important for our social development, like playing games and contact with friends. So the government, in its event, introduced a £100 million package for vulnerable pupils, and they were identified through social workers and care leavers and disadvantaged year 10s. They provided 200,000 devices and 50,000 readers. However, we know that there were 540,000 children who didn't have access, and only 37% were allocated a device. And often the problem is not just that whether or not they have access, it's whether they have enough access. So if you're the middle child in a family of 5 children and your mum needs to use the laptop actually for work meetings as well, then actually the time you can spend accessing home learning is really limited. And that's not taken into account when we do some of these calculations. And then the one thing I'm really pleased of is that the playgrounds are now open, but there was a prolonged period where they were all closed, which was such a sad thing. And we know that this is detrimental to the happiness and health of our children, but in particular, we worry about obesity. This paper, looking at the indirect effect of COVID-19, looked at some of the things that are a risk factor for developing obesity. So lack of structure, poor sleeping, the amount of time they were shut down, a vastly increased amount of screen time in that 91% of children who had a screen, less physical activity because they weren't allowed to leave the house very much, and an unhealthy diet either through poverty or boredom. And then into that, there are all these things that impact on your mental health, which is all the things that you might imagine: boredom, sadly bereavement for some families, parents arguing and worrying about money, and the parental mental health, because it's a huge challenge, particularly if one parent is made redundant, another is on furlough and things like that. So lots of things are impacting on the mental health of our children. But there are lots of things that we can do that can impact and decrease these obesogenic behaviours, or co-obesity as we're calling it in our house. And so a variety of things that we can do from the medical perspective, so health promotion, telemedicine and weight management, but things that parents can do at home as well, which is having a timetable, making sure that exercise is included as part of that. Good sleep hygiene. I'm sure you all leave your phone downstairs at 9 o'clock and don't look at it till you get up in the morning. And making sure that there are PE lessons. So Joe Wicks, I think, just got an MBE or an OBE, and I think that's one of the best given honours. He did amazing things for getting people moving during lockdown. And of course, all of these things will help to improve mental health as well. This is just a figure showing, again, those things that contribute to poor mental health, but then some things that have been identified and which funding has been put into to try and address them. We're really worried about the health of our young people. It's anecdotal, but unfortunately, over the last few months on our ward at Mary's, we've definitely seen more children with mental health issues than we normally would, both with attempted suicide, deliberate self-harm, anorexia, amongst others. And we know that there are a variety of things that come from the government and from supporting the parents through this, as well as looking at community things that we can do that can help promote the health and well-being of our young people. But across the world, poverty is becoming a huge issue secondary to COVID. There's this estimate that about 150 million additional children are living in poverty because of the pandemic. And of these, things as basic as not having access to soap and water, either at home or in school, and that healthcare facilities are not equipped to protect these children. Actually, we were very worried about how the pandemic would hit in countries in sub-Saharan Africa or across the Indian subcontinent. But actually, the outcome has been better than we anticipated. And this may be because those populations are a bit younger. But these people are still going to be long-term affected by the things that we did to try and protect them through lockdown. So we know that all of these children, 368.5 million children who would normally get a free school meal, had to find another source of daily nutrition. And there's a huge amount of research that shows that your nutritional well-being has an impact on your health and your educational outcomes. And in particular, maternal education, health and poverty is very closely aligned to child health. So we know that women are more likely than men to live in extreme poverty. And when women are living in extreme poverty, all of these things to catch up. So there are short-term consequences of undernutrition and poverty, but there are also long-term consequences. So it impacts on your productivity, your educational attainment, it impacts on reproduction. You're more likely to suffer from stillbirths and birth defects and challenging deliveries and affected babies if you have poor nutrition because your pelvis doesn't grow properly. And this leads to these things called intergenerational consequences, which feed back down here and lead to further undernutrition and disease. So looking after maternal health is one of the things that's most important that we do internationally to look after children. Very clear direct relationship between maternal health and education and child health. And this is a real worry because we know that the pandemic has hit women far more than men. So 61 versus 58% of men saw a decrease in their savings. 66% of women versus 61% of men saw a drop in their income. And you have to remember that women quite often do caring roles or cleaning roles, so they're actually also at greater risk of being exposed to coronavirus. And we know that women are adversely affected by the infection and the disease in the younger age groups. We know that men are more likely to have severe disease when they're older, and that's related probably to ACE2 expression, but also more cardiovascular risk factors. So we're very worried about these findings. We also know that violence against women and girls has intensified greatly. There are reports from France, Argentina, Cyprus, and Singapore, and all across the developed world showing an increase of up to a third in reports of domestic abuse. And all of these things have a knock-on effect, not only on the psychological well-being of the children who witness it, but also the physical well-being, because often they are directly involved in this violence as well. And then just to move on to another topic is vaccine delivery. So we know that a number of countries just shut everything down. I'm talking to colleagues that I know in Zimbabwe, many women were not attending their antenatal appointments and they weren't bringing the children for their vaccines. And children are much more likely to die of outbreaks of measles and other vaccine preventable illnesses than of COVID-19. So there's this statistic here that for every one COVID-19 death that was picked up during a routine vaccine visit, you might prevent 101 deaths in children due to vaccine preventable illnesses. So I can't overstate how important it is that we maintain our vaccine delivery internationally. And there was a big concern about polio. You might know that polio has recently been declared, we're working very hard to eradicate polio. And there was a huge concern across Pakistan that this really crucial work, which we've been working towards for over 20 years, might be affected by COVID-19. So huge drops in vaccine delivery causing anxiety. And in the UK, this was also seen. So this is from Public Health England, where they looked at the impacts of physical distancing measures on childhood vaccination counts. And what you can see here, it's quite a complex graph, is the red line represents children vaccine delivery in specifically for the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine at a year in red, and the blue in 2020, and the blue line is in 2019. And you can see this dip here that occurred in April of this year. We're very worried about this. It has caught up and is now following the usual trend, but we're not sure that all of these children have had their vaccine. And this is the first dose of the MMR given at a year. And what we haven't calculated, or we don't have data on, is how many children lost their booster dose preschool, which is really crucial because without that, you're already down about 20% of children who are protected. You may know that we were already very concerned about measles coverage in the UK prior to the pandemic. In fact, in my part of London, we had Outbreak last year. And so we're extremely worried that there may be a measles outbreak in the coming year because our coverage is affected by the pandemic as well. So we've been doing really important public health work, trying to reassure families and thinking of innovative ways that we can deliver the vaccine. So we've been doing drive-through vaccine clinics. We've been giving vaccines through pharmacies as well as in normal healthcare settings, and just trying to reach as many people as possible to encourage them to attend healthcare settings and not to be worried about coronavirus, because measles is a much greater threat to their children than COVID-19. And this could extend to other vaccines as well. But it's not all doom and gloom. This just shows you that some of the other common childhood illnesses that we worry about actually fell. So social distancing can be a protective measure. This is Scarlet Fever, which is when you get a streptococcal throat and a red rash, dropped dramatically. We were optimistically thinking this might be sustained, but also invasive group A strep, which has really high morbidity and mortality. Additionally, the rates of gastrointestinal infections drop dramatically. It turns out washing your hands is good for your health. Okay, and just some resources that have been developed to try and explain coronavirus to children. And I think for children and adults, Operation Ouch, which is by two friends of mine, Chris and Sam Van Tulligan, is actually very entertaining and educational. My children love it. Okay, so in summary, we had found very low numbers of paediatric cases. We were more worried about everything else, but critical illness and death was extremely rare. And we were doing research, we were setting up programs to look at this and see if we could help to understand the risks to adults by exploring this in children. But then unfortunately, it got a lot busier. So I'm going to present the case of an 11-year-old girl that we looked after. And I apologize for the medical terminology. Hopefully I'll explain it clearly. And she'd presented with 3 days of fever and tummy pain and diarrhea. And when she came to hospital, she was very hot and quite unwell. And all her blood tests showed that she was very inflamed. So her immune system was desperately trying to fight off some kind of infection. And some of the counts, like her platelet count, which stopped you from bleeding, had dropped. She had a positive PCR swab for SARS-CoV-2, and we weren't sure how important that was. And she had a surgical review because her tummy pain was really bad. And that just showed lots of inflammation in her gut. And so we treated her for sepsis, perhaps with an abdominal focus. We did wonder if perhaps she was an unusual child presenting with an adult-type COVID-19 disease, but her chest X-ray was unremarkable. We worried about other rarer things like toxic shock. Unfortunately, she got a lot worse, and we had to give a lot of fluid to her to help maintain the blood supply to her brain and the rest of her body. And we took her to our intensive care unit where we had to give inotropes, which are medicines which help your heart to pump more strongly. We also gave her antibody, which is an intravenous immunoglobulin, to try and fight off what we thought could be toxic shock. And we did a heart scan or an echo, and this showed that her heart was barely pumping at all, and that's why her blood pressure was so low. And her troponin, which is an enzyme produced by your heart, was extremely high, telling us that it was really struggling to do its job. So she was actually transferred for extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or ECMO, which is where we take the blood outside of the body and add oxygen and then put it back in, bypassing the heart and allowing it to heal. And we gave her lots of steroids, which turn off your immune system and decrease the inflammation. And she was then actually really, thankfully, made a good recovery. But she was on ECMO for 16 days, which is a really long time in our experience. And she's actually back at school and doing really well. So I present her as a kind of, she was one of the first children we saw with this really severe shock syndrome. And as it happens, we're all good pals in Peds ID in London. So they had 3 children who were admitted to the Evelina in a 24-hour period. And then at Great Ormond Street, they had 3 children from Essex. And so we rang each other and said, this is all a bit weird. Do we think there's something going on? We were a bit worried. Normally in normal times, we think about food poisoning or funny streptococcal infections like I just told you about. But these children were all at home and not at school because it was the middle of lockdown. So we got in touch with NHS England and the Paediatric Intensive Care Society and identified that there were 19 children nationally in 1 week that had presented with this very similar, very worrying picture. And so we went on and developed a case definition and set up some research. So this is the case definition we prepared in April. And a few weeks later, America started to have one as well. And basically, we described these children who had fevers, had evidence of inflammation, both looking at them physically, but also in their blood tests. And most worryingly, they had other organs that were affected, either the heart, the kidneys, their brains, or their gut. We had to rule out other causes like bacterial sepsis. And from our perspective at that time, it was really hard to get tests. So we weren't so worried about whether or not they had positive tests. When the WHO and I was involved in this created a case definition, they had to find evidence of there being COVID either through a swab test or a serology test. And that was the main difference. So this went on. So they presented it in Paris, which was another area where we saw lots of COVID-19. And what this figure shows, which they presented in that paper, is that orange is COVID cases across Europe. And then the bars are cases of this PIMS, or Pediatric Inflammatory Multisystem Syndrome, which I wish I'd given an easier name to say, over time. And what we can see is that this is occurring about 4 to 5 weeks later. So that gave us a bit of a hint at what was causing the problem. Subsequently in America, there were a variety of publications of small groups of children, mostly in New York, which was really badly hit by the pandemic. And then subsequently, by the end of August, 565 patients. And talking to a colleague in America in the CDC, they've now got 1,000 patients in America who all have this thing. And they called it Miss C, which I think is quite American, but actually it's probably easier to say than PIMS. So what can you do? And very proudly, it has made it onto Wikipedia. And I'm just really sad I didn't call it Whittaker syndrome. It was my one chance to have a claim to fame, but what can you do? So just to look at the worst end of the spectrum in England, we had about 78 patients, and most of these are male, which is something that's been quite interesting to us, and we don't quite know why that is. They're a bit older, so they're the kind of late preteen, early teenage years, and they presented like my patient with fever, shock, and tummy problems, but also often with rashes and red eyes. And these were healthy children with an excessive predominance of children from Black and ethnic minorities. And this has been the case in America, but not in Spain or Italy. And they usually didn't have evidence of viral replication, so their PCR test looking for the virus was often negative, but they did all have antibodies. So just thinking about what I was talking to you before, it does suggest that this is an antibody-mediated problem. This just shows you, this is what we'd have expected admissions to look like in April, the blue line, and this is what admissions actually look like in intensive care in April, May, which is why there was loads of media attention, because it was a very unusual phenomenon. And just to show you what it looks like, so these photos here, which are from a colleague in San Diego, are what Kawasaki disease looks like. So you might have heard about that in the media. So children get red eyes, red lips, red tongue, and a red rash. They often get big, swollen, painful lymph nodes, and they get swollen hands and feet. And we see a lot of that in our cohort of PIMS patients, but we also see the gut problem, like the pain in the tummy that I described, and then the shock where the heart's not working properly. And we quite often see these children are confused and have headaches as well. And then when we look at their blood tests, there are quite a few distinct differences as well. So it is quite a different phenomenon from Kawasaki disease. And just thinking of that figure I showed you before with the virus and things, this is a different way of looking at it. So most people have this curve here where you have a very little flu-like illness. Some people who are older take a bit longer to get better, and then the elderly go on and get really severe disease. And we think that this little blip here is what our MIS-C or PIMS-CF would look like. So very late, after everyone else has recovered, they get a little bit, a very small number of children get this inflammatory process. And often they don't even have a really clear history of having had a viral infection in the first place, but they do often have a family member who had it, so a parent, or they've been in contact with somebody else. And how are we managing that? So I think this is a really interesting graph. What it's showing you is that when the first cases came through, children maybe got one of the treatments that we use. So these are steroids, intravenous immunoglobulin, biologics are antibody, anti-cytokine therapies that we use specifically, and people got maybe one of them. By the middle of May, every patient who came in was getting all the treatment we had at the same time. But this is really without an evidence base. And one of the things that we most importantly need to do in medicine is make sure that we use evidence to determine how we treat people. We're often caught out where we assume that something will work, but when you go and do a randomized controlled trial, that's not the case. And I think that there have been a variety of medicines like hydroxychloroquine and things like that that have been in the media that have really proved that to be true. So although, so it's really important that we do randomized controlled trials for these children. And in our cohort, we had 58 patients in the first presentation. Actually, 13 of them got better without any treatment at all. And the others all got better with a variety of different treatments. And so I just don't know whether we know what we're doing. We're using treatments that have been used for Kawasaki disease because these are two very similar phenomena, although they're different. And everything's being done on anecdata and expert opinion rather than evidence, which makes us a little bit nervous in the medical profession. So we did something called the Delphi Process, which is where you sit down with a very large group of experts from a variety of different fields. So we have people who work in A&E and general pediatricians, people who work on the heart, so cardiologists, people who work on rheumatological or inflammatory conditions, infectious diseases, immunology, pharmacy, and everybody reviewed the literature and looked at what we thought was a sensible thing to do. Effectively, it is just expert opinion on a bigger scale, but at least it's kind of a more robust process than just, I think I'll use this treatment today, which is happening before. So what we really don't want to do is miss treatments that could be given for other conditions. That's really important. We recommend that these children are all discussed on a case-by-case basis because we don't want to, it's a really hard decision, this isn't straightforward. And they are very sick when they come in. And then we treat them based on their phenotype. And most importantly, we recruit them to any studies that are open. And at the moment, you'll probably have heard of the recovery trial. So this is the study that showed that dexamethasone or steroids are probably one of the most effective treatments we have for COVID-19. So we have created an arm of this randomized controlled trial to compare all those treatments I just told you about. So steroids, which turn off the immune system, we call it a bit like a sledgehammer, it turns everything off, versus IVIG, which just takes out your antibody, and then versus some of these specific biologics, so anti-IL-1 or anti-TNF, which are different cytokines that stimulate the immune system, and then anti-IL-6, which I mentioned in the first instance, which makes the adult so sick. And so we have a specific arm for children in recovery that we're recruiting children to, so hopefully we'll have an evidence-based answer about treatment. But we've also set up this nappily named the best available treatment study, or BAT study, not because bats gave us COVID-19, but it does fit nicely, which is an international observational study where we've got people putting in information about how their children presented and were treated from all over the world. So we have patients from Russia, Belarus, Pakistan, Colombia, Brazil, South Africa, North America, Canada, and all across Europe. And the idea is that we can gather as much data as possible from an unbiased way, and then use really clever mathematical techniques like machine learning to try and work out which treatments appear to be the most beneficial. It's not as good as a randomized controlled trial, but if a lot of people put in data, you can get some really good evidence. Okay, well, I feel like it's all a bit scary, so I just wanted to put it all into context. So I mentioned there are about 15.6 or 16 million children and young people in the UK, but there have been 78 children admitted to intensive care, and we think about 250 cases in total and 1 death. So really small numbers. And overall, from COVID in children and young people, there have been 16 deaths in total, we think. And this is a paper that looked at this and the risks. And what they showed is that in these countries, the USA, England, Italy, Germany, Spain, France, and Korea, there were 43 deaths in total in 0 to 19-year-olds out of 135 million children in 3-month period, when you would normally expect 36,000 deaths from all causes. And when you compare it to unintentional injury, which is what we call trauma deaths, they're much more common. So your child's much more likely to come off their bike or have a road traffic accident and die. They're more likely to die from other chest infections. And actually, they're almost more likely to die from flu, depending on their age. So it's really tricky to try and compare them. This is not a disease that kills people, either the PIMS, which is a bit scary, or COVID-19. I just put some other comparisons here. There were more deaths from chickenpox and meningitis than from COVID-19. And then on another positive note, because I was determined not to end sending all doom and gloom, the COVID-19 vaccine field is really fascinating. So never in the history of vaccines have we developed a vaccine quite so quickly. And this was possible because of the genomic and structural information of the virus being made available in record time. So the Chinese were really collaborative. They sequenced the virus and they shared the information, and that allowed vaccine development. But also because in countries where the first Sars virus was a problem, or MERS was a problem, there were already vaccine candidates in development which were in phase 1 trials. So we had a bit of a head start. I have to say that one of the real silver linings of this pandemic has been the international collaboration and working together of scientists for a common aim. It's really been quite extraordinary. Anyway, Moderna, which produced the first RNA vaccine, which is the type of vaccine, actually recruited the first participant in March, before we even locked down in England. So it's just really extraordinary. I think, consider it normally takes about 10 years in the vaccine field to get to the stage to really understand how impressive it is. There is as yet no licensed vaccine, and the thing that worries us in the immunology world is we don't actually know what a protective immune response looks like. And that's difficult because we don't know what to measure after giving the vaccine. So if I give you a measles vaccine, I can then come and take your blood and measure measles antibody. And if I find a certain level, I can tell you quite confidently that you're very unlikely to get measles and you're protected. However, with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2, I can't do that. We don't know for definite that antibody is protective. We don't know if it's T-cell immunity, although there is some evidence that that might be true. But it means that there is no readout. So the alternative way that you check whether the vaccine works is you give it to many hundreds of thousands of people, and then they have to be exposed to the virus. And this actually became a bit of an issue in the UK, where we did the initial vaccine trials because lots of people were vaccinated, and then transmission of the virus dropped really dramatically over the summer, so nobody was being exposed, so you weren't really testing whether the vaccine had worked or not. So there's a minor silver lining of the increase in cases over the last few months. And also, vaccine technology has really dramatically improved over the last 10 to 20 years. So the type of vaccines that are currently in use, particularly for our infant vaccines, have moved on to using nucleic acid, so bits of RNA or DNA. And this is really neat because it's so much easier to deliver. They go into the cell, they make the proteins that represent the virus themselves using your own cells. And so it's much easier to do than some of the other vaccines. They can be made really rapidly. And so we reckon if we take on RNA or a DNA vaccine, then there will be really rapid production and rollout, which is what everybody wants to hear, is that when we find an effective vaccine, we'll be able to get it going very quickly. We also use some more traditional viral vectored vaccines. What this means is you take a virus, so this stands for adenovirus or chimpanzee adenovirus, which is the vaccine that's used in Oxford, You'll have heard of the Oxford vaccine trial, and that's conjugated to a bit of the spike protein from the virus. And we know this works because the adenovirus makes your immune system respond, and then it recognizes the bit of the virus that we've given it, and then it develops a protective immune response. But also other methods have been used. And just in terms of where we are, so vaccine trials go phase 1, which is very much, is it safe? They do it in small numbers, and they're very much wanting to know, does the vaccine cause damage when it's given to a person? And then phase 2 and 3 trials are bigger safety studies, but also looking at efficacy. And so the good news is, as of the beginning of October, we have a number of vaccine candidates in phase 2 and 3 trials. So these 4 are all in phase 3 trials, and they're planning to vaccinate between 40 and 60,000 people over the next few months, with the aim that we will then be able to look at efficacy next year. So this is really good news. I think it's highly likely we'll have a vaccine by next autumn, which I know sounds far away for those people who really just want life to get on, but actually is extraordinarily quick in the grand scheme of things. What we won't know for definite is exactly how efficacious it is, but I think we'll have a reasonable idea. The feeling is that provided it's more than 50 or 60% efficacious, so it protects 50 or 60% of people, then it will make a big enough impact to be worth doing. And we'll also have we already have quite good safety data from giving the vaccine, and what we're now examining is for really rare side effects. These can occur, and occasionally they are significant enough to take a vaccine out of circulation, but hopefully we're not going to run into those problems. And then I just thought, in terms of other positives, I think nature has shown that we probably all needed to take a break. We know air pollution has improved, there are far fewer planes in the sky, the animals have taken to the streets, and we've all had a little bit more family time. And this is my children clapping for the NHS with me and drawing pictures on the side, and we've all learnt to wear our masks. So I think there's a lot of community spirit, something that we really need to build on. And I think that it's not all bad. It is all going to be okay. So just in summary, COVID-19 has a very limited direct effect on children, just this figure showing you how few children are admitted to hospital compared to adults. And we're much more concerned about the indirect of the pandemic and the things that we've done to control the pandemic and how they impact their physical, emotional and mental health. But don't worry, because I think that we will have a vaccine here as soon as anything. So thank you very much, and I'm going to end there.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was really, really interesting, and I think it's given us lots to think about. We have a couple of questions in the chat, but if anyone else has a question, please feel free to just put your hand up or place it in the chat. So if I start with something that's a bit more general, so there's been a lot of confusing data and messaging regarding infectious period of SARS-CoV-2 versus its incubation period. Could you please help detangle the two concepts? And do we know how this differs for children and adults?
Okay, so the incubation period, so for most people following exposure, they develop symptoms within 5 days, okay? However, we know that it can be up to 14 days, and that is the minority. And that's the basis on which we try to, we set the 14 days incubation period or quarantine period of self-isolation after you've been exposed, because we would expect nearly everybody who's been exposed to develop infection in that time period. So that's your incubation period. Your infectious period, you're probably most infectious for the 24 hours before you develop symptoms, and possibly for the 24-hour period after that. We know, and the way we measure infectiousness is not about detection, and this is really tricky, and this is why people talk about false positives with the PCR swab. So the PCR just picks up the genetic material of the virus, and it can be there for weeks, and so it's not very useful. What we know about infectiousness is if we can incubate and culture the virus, then it's likely to be infectious, and we know that it's a maximum of 7 days, really, that you would be able to culture the virus. We tend to ask people to stay away from each other for 10 days to be really sure, because there have been a couple of case reports of people being infectious for longer. So it's a lot of belts and braces. A lot of the decision making around policy is us trying to do our best to make sure we protect the majority. And actually for children, it's probably no different. The one thing that does appear from 1 or 2 studies that children are infectious for a shorter period of time. And we think that's possibly because they're in nasal mucosa, and that innate immunity I spoke about clears the virus really quickly. And the second thing is that it doesn't go to their lungs, so they're not coughing it up. So most transmission is from coughing and aerosol and droplets. And also they've got smaller lungs, so their tussive power or their ability to cough far is limited compared to older people.
Thank you. So we've got lots of questions coming in. I'm going to go through them in order that they've been presented. So the next question we have is, what evidence have you seen of long COVID symptoms in children, particularly adolescents and young teenagers?
So really gratefully, we haven't seen very much at all. But one of the things that we're slightly concerned about is that it's not being self-reported. So with the WHO and ISARIC, I'm on a working group to do a questionnaire of young people internationally, but we'll be doing it in the UK to try and ascertain how big a problem it is, so that we can set up systems to address it. It doesn't seem to be as problematic as it is in adults. But I doubt if it doesn't exist at all. I just think it's a much smaller problem. But we're really keen to try and identify exactly how big a problem. And it'll be complicated because some of the things that contribute to that, including mental health, are affected just by lockdown, never mind having the COVID-19.
Okay, thank you. Is there any evidence of differences in ACE2 expression in the few badly affected children?
So ACE2 expression isn't that simple to measure, but it's a really good question. So it is one of the things I think will be looked at, but I don't know of any evidence. We know that generally they express less, but we haven't checked it in that cohort themselves.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to go through. Is there a vaccine developed? How will it be administered and to whom?
Okay, as I showed you, there are something like 20. There were 250 vaccines developed. I think there were 28 in clinical trials, and there were 5 in phase 2 or 3 clinical trials, which is where we want them to be. That means they are imminently going to be licensed, and once they're licensed, we can start giving it to everybody. They're all intramuscular, and bad news, we don't have any that are given as nasal sniffs, which I think would make the kids much happier. We are going to, because you have to make them. There's some logistics involved in this, and the most likely thing is that they will first be given to those who are most vulnerable, which is the elderly, and then they'll be given to healthcare workers, both because we get more exposure, but also because we're more likely to pass it on because we see the patients all the time. And then after that, they'll be given to vulnerable people under 50, if I understand. Children will be the last to get it, but they really don't need it, to be honest.
Okay, and I think this is a question that many parents might have. It's, whilst children aren't severely affected by COVID, how much do we know about children being carriers of the virus and passing it on to more vulnerable categories?
And it is a really good question. I think particularly teachers, staff members in schools were very anxious about this. We are getting increasingly reassuring data from Germany, Iceland, Israel, Italy, Spain, and America most recently, where they've reopened schools, showing that children aren't transmitting it up to adults. So children actually very rarely pass it on to anyone. They mostly get it from adults. So most outbreaks in school and transmission in school does appear to be from adult to adult or from adult to child. And so we know that's a concern. I think particularly for families, one of the things I didn't go into because of time was shielding, and the worry that there is for siblings and parents of shielded people, because it's a huge impact. If you live in a family of 4 kids and one of the children has cardiovascular disease, for example, or it has a big risk for something, it's very worrying for the 3 other children to go to school. So this is all bad for your mental health. But we actually think that provided there's relatively reasonable hygiene going on in the house and a little bit of sensible behaviour around when people are symptomatic, that the risk is extremely low.
Okay, and you mentioned the widening gap in education due to the virus. What is your best suggestion for combating this and other mental health issues caused by it?
So we've really been working hard with the Royal College of Paediatrics and the government and the Department of Education to really, and everyone takes a different take on this, we're really keen to keep schools open. We have a lot of evidence that children don't drive community transmission, but that community transmission is reflected in schools, because if it's in the community, it's in the parents, it's in the children. And so one of the most important things that we want to do is keep schools open, but we also need investment in home learning. And there's been wonderful work in the schools themselves to try and access laptops for young people. And the BBC and a variety of other places have made sound bites and various educational tools available for young people. So in the mental health stuff, I put some of the mitigations, and I'm happy to share the slides on that. But it is very much about listening and acknowledging that there could be a problem. Keeping the door open for young people so that they can talk to others is always such a key thing to do.
Yeah, so we've actually, continuing on from that, we've got a student here who's asked quite a personal question about her own brother. She So you mentioned the effect of schools. Knowing what my younger brother, 15, has gone through during the COVID lockdown, I have a question. He has now been sent off school. His whole school is locked down again for 2 weeks due to another case. If there is such a low probability of children getting COVID-19, is locking down school more to protect adults? And how do you overcome this long term, as children can't keep missing school for their own health?
Yeah, it is a real conundrum. And actually, it really depends on how the schools is set up. So the advice from PHE is that just close contacts need to self-isolate, but every teacher and school governors and the teachers and the head teachers make decisions together, and some people are more risk averse than others, and that does unfortunately lead to some schools being closed down. It may be because there was a big outbreak within the school, and sometimes a bit like the circuit break you've been hearing about, closing the school for 2 weeks might do a really good job of just dampening that down a bit, and so that might be a bit behind it. But it is really challenging. We're trying to put intelligent, sensible, pragmatic, reassuring things in place to say you don't necessarily need to close down the whole school. You just need to do some risk assessments about who's most likely to be at risk after that. And for under 12s in particular, I'd be a real advocate of following what the Dutch and the French have done, which is they don't test children under 12 at all, because children under 12 permanently have a snotty nose. They're disgusting, right? But most of the time, it's not coronavirus. And so if you test them every time they have something, they're going to miss loads of school just because they're being tested, but they don't have it and they're not passing it on. And so it'd be more pragmatic to keep the test to one side for older people who may be more likely to have it because they get fewer other infections. But I have yet to persuade Chris Whitty. He's not, I don't know him well enough to get into it.
Okay, so I have my last question here is how safe are the vaccines likely to be, seeing as they're being rushed through their phases?
So I would like to reassure people, because I work in the vaccine field. I've been a principal investigator on a number of vaccine studies, and I know the groups who do this. I'm involved in quite a lot of the conversations. They're not necessarily being rushed through these phases, the phase 2, phase 3. As I said, there were great advantages in that there were already candidates that we've changed slightly. And the UK, and it's great that we live here, has amazing regulation around this. I have absolute confidence that everything is being followed to a T. You'll have heard of when the trial was held, when there was a case they were concerned about. That's happened on 2 or 3 occasions, and they are taking every precaution they need to. I've spoken personally to 2 of the lead guys, both at Imperial and at Oxford, who happily would have either vaccine themselves. They're older men who are potentially more at risk, so I don't know if that biases it, but I think that in my experience, the vaccine infrastructure in the UK is set up in a way that we can have confidence in it. I wouldn't like to comment on the Russian vaccines that are already being used, but to be honest, they're probably using similar technology, so they probably are safe, but they've been really rushed through, whereas the UK is going in a step-by-step, sensible manner to assess these vaccines.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got so many more questions coming, but we've really run out of time. So I'm just going to say thank you to you. And I'll end with a comment that has been put on the chat that says, such a brilliant and intelligent speaker. The children of the UK are lucky to have you.
Oh.
So thank you very much, Liz Whittaker.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We hope you have a good evening. Goodbye.